Associate at NBER and the Center for Analysis of Post-Secondary Education and Employment, a non-resident senior fellow in the Economic Studies program at the Brookings Institution. I believe a first-generation college student who earned an AB in Social Studies from Harvard, a Master of Public Policy from Harvard, and a PhD in Economics from MIT. Sue has been on too many boards to mention, but you can go to her website if you'd like to read about her boards. And her research focuses on the effectiveness of charter schools, the optimal design of financial aid, the price elasticity of private school attendance, the relationship between post-secondary schooling and labor market outcomes, and the effect of high school reforms on academic achievement and educational attainment. And I know Sue best because of her very active Twitter presence. She's one of the handful of, I would say, most prolific education researcher Twitterers. And has far surpassed my Twitter following in just a very short amount of time. Not that I am jealous about that. And she also writes for the New York Times in their Upshot blog. So thanks very much.
All right, thanks very much for having me. But President-elect of AEFP, that's the most important.
Wow.
The association, well, it hasn't been updated yet.
Okay.
You must know.
I do know, yes. I believe I voted for you.
Yeah, so the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. If this kind of stuff interests you, that's the conference to go to hear more about this kind of work, policy-relevant education research. So I'm president-elect, and I get to plan the next one, which is in Washington, D.C. in March. So you should come. Great conference. All right, so this is joint work with Catherine Mitchellmore. She is a postdoc, an IES postdoc, Institute for Education Sciences funded postdoc at University of Michigan, and she's headed to Syracuse next year. This work this is a very simple paper, by the way. This is a straightforward paper. It emerges from work that I've been doing for many years using administrative data. So you've probably noticed that in education research at this point, an awful lot of work that's being done makes use of the administrative data that's produced by districts, by schools, by states. This has been explicitly encouraged by the U.S. Department of Education, which has funded states, districts, schools to improve their infrastructure, their data infrastructures, develop longitudinal data systems. The fiscal stimulus during the recession, some of the money that went to states explicitly was contingent on the states building out their longitudinal data systems. So the feds have been pushing this. The Institute for Education Sciences has explicit grant programs that are intended to encourage partnerships that use these data, researcher-educator partnerships that use these data. So making these data useful is very, very, very important. So I've been working with Brian Jacob for the past 5 or forever years, it feels like now, building out Michigan's data system for research purposes. Many states have extensive data systems, but they're used for accountability and reporting systems purposes only. Like they use it to tell the feds what the feds want to hear. They use it to report out stuff to the Office of Civil Rights, that sort of thing. But they're not used actively by researchers to ask questions about the effectiveness of policies. And so we were building out a researcher version of this data set to do just that. And as we were making use of it, the benefit of these data sets is that they're huge. So we've got several million people now in our data set. It goes back to 2003. It tracks everybody who has touched the Michigan public school system since 2003. Follows them from kindergarten through 12th grade with their test scores, what school they're at, and then if they go to college, we've got data that follows them into college as well. If they go to public colleges in Michigan, we've got transcripts for them. If they go to a college outside of Michigan, we've got the National Student Clearinghouse data, which basically is they go to a certain college for a certain amount of time, whether they get a degree. So benefit of it is sort of big N, right? Downside of it is small x, right? So there are not many variables in these data sets. So these data sets, have what I just described, but in terms of describing the demographics of students, you'll have whether they are an English learner, you'll have race and ethnicity, you'll have sex, you'll have whether they are assigned a special education status. So ELL and special ed are actually outcomes of schooling. Schools decide whether to do that stuff. The only measure you've got, like, of a kid's family background, what they're bringing into the school, besides the race and ethnicity stuff, is a measure of whether they're eligible for a subsidized meal. So whether they're eligible for a free or subsidized lunch, and then sometimes also breakfast and some schools. So that's the measure that people use. When you hear people using these data sets and saying something like, half of US students are in poverty, what they're actually saying is that half of US students are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. Kids up to 185% of poverty can get these benefits. So it's a very crude measure of socioeconomic status. And we were trying to improve on that. So that's what this paper is about. Okay, so as of a few years ago, over half of all public school kids were eligible for subsidized meals. And the data sets that I worked with, these administrative data sets, will have year by year whether these kids are eligible for it in that year. And it's widely used as a proxy for poverty when we're measuring achievement gaps. So NCLB and now ESA both require reporting out of test scores by subsidized lunch versus not subsidized lunch status. And the gap between those, in Michigan, for example, is used as a measure of school success. So schools that have particularly large gaps are put on a list. Right? So this is used for research purposes, it's used for accountability purposes. And the question is, that we have was how well does this proxy approximate childhood poverty? Seeing this right here, nearly half, kind of tells you right off the bat that it's a pretty rough proxy. Anything that categorizes half of all children as being economically disadvantaged is not getting at the most economically disadvantaged. So, ex ante, we can say that. But this makes the point concretely. So down here is the US and Michigan child poverty rate based on household surveys of income. So it's the share of children who live in households in poverty. And Michigan looks a lot like the rest of the country. And it's 20-25%, depending on where you're looking. Up here is the dark green is the share of Michigan kids who are eligible for a subsidized meal. The light green is the US share, again, very similar, and about twice the level of the poverty rate. And this is mechanical. I mean, you're eligible if you have up to 185% of the poverty cutoff in your family. You get free if you're 130% or below. Right? So mechanically, it's not supposed to be capturing straight up poverty, but it is how people typically interpret it.
Is it possible to distinguish between free and subsidized?
In some data sets, including ours, and I'll show you, many people who are working with this data, though, don't have it split out. And in any case, I'm going to show you that we're able to get some more information than that provides. In Michigan, about 80% of the kids who are eligible for either are getting free. So the density and the income distribution is not very large in that area between 130% and 185% apparently.
And this is the kids who are eligible, because I know in some schools, they just give it to everyone.
Right, right. This community eligibility is a new thing going on. As you can see in Michigan, it's tracking pretty well. The overall level of eligibility in the U.S. is tracking quite well this 185% thing. So indeed, there are whole schools that are being made eligible, but they tend to be schools in which 95% of the kids are poor. Therefore, you're not getting a whole lot of error on the whole thing. Michigan still measures. I'll walk through in a minute how people are apply for the program, and this will come up then. So ask a question if I don't answer it. So gaps in student achievement, student attainment are of increasing interest to researchers. Dick Renane and Greg Duncan put out a book a couple of years ago through Russell Sage Foundation called Wither Opportunity that focused completely on income gaps and educational attainment and in achievement. And one thing that Sean Reardon documented in that book was that the test score gap between kids whose incomes are in the 90th percentile of household incomes and kids whose families have incomes at the 10th percentile has been growing over time. And it's grown 40% over 25 years, and it's now at about a standard deviation. It's larger than the black-white test score gap. If you plot the black-white test score gap, that's been going down over time. It's like a scissors the income gap has been rising at just about exactly the same rate. Now, these measures, this is from survey data. These are from periodic surveys. You can't get at 90-10 gaps using administrative data. You've got a blunt 50% dummy that breaks up students into either eligible or not eligible. And it's trying to make that finer that we're focusing on here. Most of this research, even that uses detailed survey data and lots of information on household income, which is not present in these administrative data sets, relies on a point-in-time measure of family income. What's the income today? Is the family in poverty today? And doesn't leverage the longitudinal nature of many of these data sets. A smaller set of papers does. So this set of papers, using fairly old data at this point, looks at the chronically poor versus the never poor. So use longitudinal information about a kid's family background and see who has been always poor and compare those to who were never poor and find substantially larger gaps than what you get from a point-in-time measure. Right? At any given point in time, if you see somebody is poor, they may have just bounced into that and they're going to bounce back out. And there's some people who are just going to be consistently poor the whole time. And when these survey data analyses pull those students out, they're found to be considerably behind the other kids. And we basically are going to be trying to do the same thing, but using administrative data. Okay? An upside of the administrative data relative to these survey data is that survey data is increasingly suffering from non-response. Bruce Meyer and co-authors have a couple of terrifying papers that show a very high increase in the rate of non-response to household surveys. We kind of all heard about this stuff in the context of polls. So we know, for election polls, people increasingly just they don't have a landline and they don't answer the phone. The same kind of thing is going on with household surveys. And it's pretty scary when you look at the numbers. A 50% non-response rate on income in some cases. And then there's attrition from the surveys. And the surveys are very expensive. So, leveraging additional information from these longitudinal surveys, administrative surveys, can do something interesting and cheap. All right, so what we're going to do is look at, I said we've got a panel, and I said the X was small, the N was big, the T's in between. We've got a panel of 13 years for Michigan. So we can track kids going back to 2003 now. And we're going to leverage that longitudinal data. So we're going to use data from Michigan's public schools to compare and do sort of a horse race between different measures of disadvantage. These are the typical measures used in looking at income gaps, in economic gaps between kids' performance. So you might look, this year, is a kid eligible for free lunch? What's their test scores? Compare that to test scores for kids who are not. So we're going to look at these. Not disadvantaged, currently eligible for a subsidized meal, which is that you're less than 185%, eligible for free meals, which means you're less than 130%. And then we're going to compare it to measures of longitudinal disadvantage. And it's very, very simple. We're going to split it up into kids who are never disadvantaged during the 9 years we observe them in the schooling system, because we're focusing on the 8th grade scores. Those who are eligible every year, and this is going to turn out to be about 15% of students are going to be eligible every year, as opposed to 60% are eligible at some point in their career. And then in the middle, we're going to put these. So this is going to end up being about 15%, 40%, 45%. Did I add to 100? I think I did. So we're able to split it up into 3 pretty big groups that we can use to make comparisons about educational achievement.
So is the temporarily disadvantaged bundling, ones versus...
For now we are. I'll show you some stuff that breaks it out by number of years. It's really interesting. All right, so this is the preview. 1 in 4 of our 8th graders who were ever eligible, now ever eligible is the broadest category, 60% of them are ever eligible. A quarter of those were eligible every year between K and 8. Okay, so 15% of all 8th graders are always eligible. They perform a full standard deviation below never disadvantaged kids. Okay, so that's comparable to that 90-10 number that I showed you from Yearkin. Right, it's approximating that. the gaps go up linearly with each year of disadvantage. This is really kind of, we're going to dig into this a little bit, try to understand what's going on, but it's not like there's some critical number of years. We basically see with each additional year, the gap gets bigger. All right, so it's good to understand where this flag that we use comes from. Right, so it comes from the National School Lunch Program. It's an $11 billion federal program. 31 million kids subsidized through it. There are 2 routes to certification. This is the being certified as being eligible. This is the traditional route. A parent will, the school will send out a notice saying, apply for a subsidized meal. They bring in pay stubs. It's not based on previous year's tax forms or something. It's monthly income that triggers it. And if your income this month falls into one of these categories, you actually get it for the whole school year. So, this is not going to jive perfectly with income survey data that looks at the persistence of poverty over a year, for example, because once you're in, you're in. Increasingly, states are using this method, direct certification. They're worried about fraud here, right? Always worried about fraud, waste, and abuse. So they're moving to this method. This method has the state combing through its records on which children are getting TANF, welfare, who's getting WIC, women, infants and children food supplements, SNAP, which is the new name for food stamps, or if there's foster kids in the house. All of these categories make somebody eligible for the subsidized lunch. Those flags get sent from Health and Human Services in the state over the Department of Education in the state. And that kid is automatically certified as eligible. Doesn't have to go through any application process. Right now, 80% of the kids in Michigan who are eligible automatically. And this is spreading across the states. Okay, so this is coming to a school district near you, if it hasn't already. It's nice, it's the procedures for getting this stuff are a lot tougher than this. Right, so they're sort of thinking that this stuff is a better screen than this stuff is, and then also they don't have to do anything additional. They don't have to do anything to get any additional proof of eligibility. So I'd say it's a good thing. And by the way, if you're working with administrative data, if you can get the state to give you these flags, then you won't have to go through the kind of machinations that I'm going through with these data to try to identify these kids. So right now we're working with Michigan to get them to give us these specific flags. Because, I can then say, this kid has got income below the cutoff for TANF, and this kid's got income below the cutoff for WIC. Right now, we don't have it. Yep.
Did you see any sort of changes or discontinuities between the years, between when they go?
No, it was pretty darn smooth, right? That's why, right, so, this line is Michigan. So nothing, there's just sort of a steady increase going on. Different school, I don't know why. It might be that this, interacted with the end of, maybe would have seen this go down with the end of the recession, but because at the same time they were bringing in direct cert. So it's reducing it's increasing the take-up rate among eligibles, right? That's basically what's going on, but there's no sharp discontinuity here. And it happens statewide, so we can't really look for sort of within state comparisons. But it'd be interesting if somebody could compare states that did this at different times. And I know they did. A third route to certification is something called community certification. So if a school has a sufficient number of kids who are individually eligible, I don't know what the threshold is, it's pretty high. But once it is, they just say, okay, all the kids will get the free lunch. Yep.
So the district's record, for example, the income and the pay stub, does that information exist, or it gets destroyed, or do you have to apply for it?
In Michigan, there's still, so these folks, we know their income's below this stuff, right? So what they tell us in Michigan is they're still having people apply and put in their information. They're supplementing it with this for anybody who doesn't apply. But income is used as a trigger for all sorts of subsidies in the state, as well as for federal funds. So I'm not quite sure, how this is going to be interacting with these federal programs that depend on the portion of the kids in your school who are basically economically disadvantaged. Maybe it's just going to be the portion of kids who get this. But it's still in Michigan, they are still having people apply, and then they're topping up using the administrative data.
It would be great if they gave you the income data.
Well, what a great idea. Juan. I never thought of that.
Well, no, but I mean, it would be.
Juan knows my students, so this is why I'm able to beat up on him.
him.
Yeah, I beat up on him for many, many years. Yep.
So this system still requires families to seek it.
This is what we're told, yes.
Yeah.
Well, you're still, they still gather the applications. These folks are automatically certified.
But they have
You do not have
they
to-
have to seek it?
No,
Okay, so
This
it's
is
automatically,
automatic.
okay.
yep. So really, this is not necessary, but they're still doing it. I do not know why. Yep,
I know in California, having children in LA Unified School District, part of the application process is this actual application. So once you go and you enroll your child in school for the academic school year, you are given that application. Sometimes they give it to you in the mail prior
Yep.
to you actually coming to school.
so you don't have to seek it out. It's right there,
but
it's
you're-
pushed out to you.
Every person is
Yeah.
required to fill it out. If you don't fill it out, they won't let you come back to school.
Interesting.
So you have to submit that application. If you're eligible, fine. If you're not eligible, fine.
Yep.
But they need that information from each
All right.
person.
So maybe it's the same kind of system. You know, that's the form that I always threw out. Maybe I was supposed to be filling it out. You know, a lot of the issues that we know are operative in terms of take-up and stigma and so forth that could occur here have kind of been eliminated in the school lunch programs because, you know, the kids, you've probably been in schools recently, kids don't go up with money to the register, right? They've got these cards that their parents load money onto, or if it's free, they just pass it through and they're not charged, but all the kids look the same. Now, this is not true in every district, but you know, the system typically has moved away from money and towards a card. When some kids have their card loaded, it's free for you, and others have money loaded on. All right, I think I told you about all of this stuff. So, I mean, obviously, getting income matched on would be fabulous. It's a different agency. If you haven't done, you know, agencies don't like to pass data back and forth in the US. It's actually easier for a private entity to get data from a public agency than for two agencies to talk to each other and link up their data. This is kind of like the big brotherism in the US that we're nervous about, big government and big data. So there are lots of prescriptions in Michigan and in other states on agencies trading data back and forth. In the federal government too. So in the federal government, there are bans on having a unit record system that would track college students between colleges, for example. There's a law against it. That's another seminar. All right, so we have this administrative data, universal students at Michigan Public Schools. We're going to focus on 3 cohorts of 8th graders. Each cohort is about 100,000 kids. Only restriction we're going to have is that we need the 8th grade math scores, because that's our outcome. We've done this with reading scores. It's very similar. And we need 7th grade scores because we're going to do a horse race between controlling for somebody's 7th grade score versus controlling for their history of economic disadvantage and see which one provides more information. And we've also done this with, you know, creating a balance panel where everyone has to be in Michigan the whole time and the results basically look the same.
Why 8th grade, too?
Why what?
Why starting 8th grade?
Because it lets us look at 9 years of disadvantage. Right, so we've also done it for like, that's the last one before high school. The next test is in 11th grade. So it's the last one we can get before they enter high school. We've also done it with 5th grade. And, you know, it looks similar, but smaller because, as I'm going to show you, each year has an increase. I said this. All right, so here's how the sample breaks out when we do this. So here are the sort of standard contemporaneous measures. 47% of these students are currently eligible for a free or subsidized lunch, and of that 47, you know, 80% of them is free. So we don't actually get that much more information by just focusing on the free kids. Most of the kids who are getting it are getting free. And then 53% are neither. But if you look at the longitudinal information, 59% have ever been eligible at some point, 14% the whole time, and 45% bouncing in and out, leaving 41% who are never. Right? So you've got your 3 groups, the 41% who are never eligible, the 14% who are always eligible, and the 45% who bounce in and out. All right, this is the money slide. This is the contemporaneous difference between those who are currently versus not currently eligible. standardized scores, standard deviation 1 means 0, so difference of 0.69 for the current measure. If we compare the free versus the reduced, there's a gap of 0.33 in there. So definitely the free kids are the worst off. And the free versus not currently, 0.74. These are the longitudinal measures. Never versus persistently, almost a standard deviation. Persistently versus transitorily, right? These are the kids who will always versus those who bounce in and out. This is the extra 0.23. And then the never versus transitorily, 0.7. Yep.
So this is for students who were stayed in Michigan during the entire period? No?
Nope. We've done it that way, but it didn't make much of a difference. So only restriction we've got is they have valid 7th and 8th grade math test scores. We basically put in a dummy for bounced in and out. We have limited it, but I was concerned that it's the same. You know, you limit it, you don't have these problems, but you worry about external validity. Michigan's been shrinking for a while, right? So you worry that the ones who remain are different in some way, but it doesn't affect the results.
Okay. I was just curious if your data would also be able to look at students who bounced around to different districts.
Oh yeah, that's in here, because
and
we're
whether there are
statewide.
changes by income.
Yep. Oh yeah, we could use it for that. People have used these data to look at instability, and definitely low-income kids are more likely to bounce around, especially urban low-income kids. They're much more likely to sort of bounce around within a 25-mile radius than they are to leave the state. So there's mobility within the state, but low-income people don't tend to cross state lines as much as, say, high-income people do. So of our 8th graders, 80% have been present during the whole time. 20% spent at least 1 year not in the system. And that could have been because they were in a private school or because they were out of state. So my kids, one of my kids would show up as being always in the system, and the other kid would show up as being out for part of it because he started in 3rd grade.
These are raw, so are you controlling for gender or anything?
No, this is just raw. This is just, nothing's going on here. I'm going to show what happens when we add controls, but this is just a raw gap. It's what's discussed in policy circles. This is column 1 in Fryer and Levitt, right? What's the gap? And then we're going to add stuff to it to see what happens. Right, so, and just to get this is going to then feed into the controls, give you a sense of what these groups look like. If you compare the currently to the not eligible, well, the nots are much more white. But here's what I want you to actually focus on. Currently free, which is a standard measure, versus the persistently. So the persistently poor kids are much less likely to be white than the kids who are currently subsidized. They're much more likely to be black. They're considerably more likely to be Hispanic. Michigan's not a big Hispanic state. 8% of the currently subsidized are Hispanic, 12% for the persistently. They're more likely to be urban. They're more likely to be concentrated in schools where a lot of the kids are eligible, right? But what we're going to find is that this difference between these kids persists within schools. We're going to do some stuff with school fixed effects, and the difference between the kids who are persistently versus transitorily poor is going to carry through, even within schools. So this is not just a story about schools being different from each other, but it's kids within schools. Any questions about this? All right. We wanted to, we don't have income, but we wanted to compare, see what we could do applying this to a survey data set that does have income. This is the Eccles Early Childhood Longitudinal Survey. It's a kindergarten class of 1998, and they've been following kids since then. Every other year, we've got information about their income and whether they are getting a free or subsidized lunch. So we can kind of look at, recreate our measures. Can't do it quite the same way because it's just every 2 years, but can break it into never disadvantaged, transitorily disadvantaged, persistently. They're 8th grader, we've got 8th grade information on them. So it's a similar analysis. And what we can see is if we look at their income in, this is 8th grade income, the persistently disadvantaged, their incomes average $18,000. Now this is a national survey, right? So these are poor, poor kids, right? So the picture I originally had in my mind when I was looking at this was like each additional year of disadvantage hurts a kid, and it's cumulative in some way. But it's not that each of these kids is getting the same yearly dose of poverty. It's that these kids are at a way lower level. And if you think of income being kind of, somewhat random, bounces around, random walk with drift, if you're at the lowest income level, you never bounce above the cutoff. If you're kind of in the middle, you might in some years bounce above the cutoff and bounce back down again. So these kids, 18,000. The transitorily, 31,000. Not rich, but almost twice as much. And the never, 71,000. Again, this is a national survey. Yep.
For the parent's education, does that come from the student or from the parent?
The kindergartner? Kindergartner did not report. They interview the parents.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
They interview the parents, yeah. So the education differences, there's just, look at that. 2% with a college degree for the persistently disadvantaged, 24, big differences in the socioeconomic status of these groups, right? And again, the standard measure lumps these together, right? So this group of kids who are at any point in time are getting these benefits, huge heterogeneity in who they are, yet it's the flag that's being used for targeting resources, for looking at inequality, as a control in studies that are trying to control for differences between kids. Right? So, you think you're sort of controlling for socioeconomic status by lumping these kids together. There are huge differences within this. I was just talking to Catherine. Think about a VAM measure, value-added measure for teachers or for schools, that's trying to control for the socioeconomic status of the kids. And 2 classrooms both have 90% kids who are eligible for subsidized lunch. But in one of the classrooms, almost all the kids are persistently disadvantaged from this column, and the other classroom, it's these kids. You're going to get a biased measure of those teachers' productivity and of the school's productivity. So, as I said, this is a simple paper, but I think it kind of matters a lot for a lot of research and a lot of policy. Yep.
Have you been able to do this sort of exercise with census tract data? Tell me how. Tell me what you would be looking at. Who's census tract and? The census tract of all, because I'm thinking that might be the most precise way to measure.
I'm going to show you stuff that's going to have school fixed effects and zip code fixed effects. So we'll get to that. So that would be the equivalent of including, like, say, zip code level income or school level income. It gets small. A lot of this is across schools, but there's a chunk of it that's within schools.
Sue, have you tried creating VAMs to see what would happen? I mean, you have the
Never
data.
made a VAM.
I know people in your shop have made VAMs.
Brian has made VAMs, I believe.
So
yes,
I mean,
I
I'd
think
love
that
to
would
see
be-
what the kind of bias you actually would get if you.
This might be a great thing for us to partner on because Michigan just killed its teacher-student data link. So we can't do VAMs in Michigan. So the feds...
Not in California either, but in districts in California you can.
So maybe this tiny little district that you partner with, we could do this kind of exercise. Because I think that this just came to me like a couple of weeks ago. I was like, duh, this is like, matters a lot for assessment of teachers and of schools, but we can't do it in Michigan.
Yeah.
As soon as the feds basically said, you don't have to do teacher-student data link, Michigan said, we're not doing teacher-student data link, and they killed it. So we have 3 years of data, and it's a mess. It's never gotten in really good shape, but we would like to do this in another setting. We're talking with David Figlio about doing this in Florida as well. Michigan it looks like it tracks the nation in a lot of stuff, but Michigan's Michigan. So we'd like to see if this same pattern holds in another place that's got a different income distribution, different set of socioeconomic realities, different labor markets. All right. So, because just plain means don't count, we'll do a regression analysis too to see what happens. And what we're going to find persistently is that, the gaps get smaller when you control for stuff, but always it's that the gap that uses the longitudinal measure is 40% bigger. 40% bigger on a smaller base, but it's always bigger than the measure that just uses a contemporaneous disadvantage. Okay, so you all know how regression analysis works. Here it is visually. I'll show you the standard errors and stuff in a second. The light blue lines are the raw differences that I just showed you, right? So the persistently poor, the 0.94, currently poor, 0.7, transitorily poor, around 0.7 as well. Add in what we've got for demographics. We're avoiding demographics, I'm going to say, that are a function of school actions. So like whether you're assigned to special ed or whether you're assigned to ELL. But we're using all the race stuff, dummied out as we can, interacting all of that with gender. What else is in there? Basically kind of not much stuff, but what we have. And it still goes down. It goes down. right? But it goes down for the currently poor, it goes down for the persistently poor, but the relative difference, it's still always the case that the persistence one is bigger than what you get from the other measures. Then this has got school fixed effects. So this is within a school, comparing the scores of kids who are transitorily, who are always eligible versus never eligible. So this gets rid of all the cross-school differences in socioeconomic status, school quality, neighborhood income, and so forth. And it's still quite large. This is different from the black-white gap. So when you do the same exercise with the black-white gap, if you look at the Fryer and Levitt papers, when you put in the school fixed effects, most of it goes away. I suspect that this is because this is an empirical question, but that we are more racially segregated than we are economically segregated in our schools. Right? There are white schools that have middle-class kids and poor kids in it, but our schools are much more segregated on race. All right, here's the non-visual representation, right? So we've got two sets of regressions. This is the contemporaneous measures, currently disadvantaged versus not. And this is a separate regression, that is the persistently disadvantaged compared to the never, and the transitorily compared to the never. The omitted group is the never. So these are the same numbers you've seen. I'm just going to now show what happens when you add stuff. These are the demographics. Doesn't do that much in terms of the explanatory power. They both go down, but they go down kind of proportional to each other. So it's still picking up more of a gap. This is the school fixed effects, right? Still, still quite large and larger than the contemporaneous measure. And we're up to 0.27. This is the 8th grade school fixed effect. We had to pick some school to be the effect, it's the 8th grade. And then this is the zip code, right? So this is now not only where you go to school, but where you live. It doesn't do a whole lot more to the whole thing. Okay, so I think this gets at this question of how much of this is these kids live in different places and go to different schools. This is huge within school gaps, right? These are essentially going to be within classroom gaps as well. Okay, and then prior test scores. Now that, so 7th grade test scores, you would think are going to encompass everything that's happened to the kid in the past 8 years. And we usually take lag test score as an excellent way to control for unobserved differences between kids, right? And typically that's what we do. We control for lag test score in some BAMs. We control for it in very observational studies. Obviously you get a huge R-squared when you regress something on its lag. But the difference still remains. It's much smaller now. This is the difference for the currently disadvantaged, about 1/10 of a standard deviation. The persistently, it's still statistically different from this one, and this is a small difference, so let's see,
Still about 40%.
Yeah, it's still pretty big, and when you're looking at, when you aggregate these up into a class-wide BAM, or when you compare schools, these differences would add up quite a bit. And when you're looking at school level variation across schools, differences as small can make a difference between whether you are in the bottom 5% or not in the bottom 5%. Or whether you're an excellent teacher this year or a middling teacher this
We
year.
think you would be over-controlling when you control for prior test scores, at least in the persistent disadvantage, because it's a...
Of course. But the point here was to say that, does the persistence disadvantage add additional information on top of prior test scores? And it does. If you were over-controlling, I would think this would just go to 0, right? But it still adds information once you control for the prior test scores.
Do you have first grade test scores?
No, because we don't have first grade tests.
What's the earliest test you have?
Third.
What happens if you control for third grade test scores?
Haven't done that yet. So I'd like to control for all the scores we've got and see what happens. All right. What time is it?
It's 22.
All right. I'm doing fine. This compares the free versus the reduced price and using the currently free. I'm not gonna sound. Okay, so now this is, that sort of got at this question of what do the 7th grade scores do. We're going to do a regression now that explicitly does a horse race between this measure of persistent disadvantage and test scores. In this one, we introduced the test scores after all this stuff had come in. And what we're thinking is that many researchers, they're going to have the lag test score. and they're gonna control for that if they have it. You know, what if they instead had this measure? What more could it tell them? All right, so again, this is the currently disadvantaged. This is the currently disadvantaged when you add the test scores. This is currently disadvantaged once you add in the measures of whether somebody is persistently disadvantaged or intermittently. They haven't spent all of their time. And what you can see is that this gets quite small. The current disadvantage gets quite small, but these persist. Right? So the persistently disadvantaged, it is adding more information. Tenth of a standard deviation is kind of big in the education world. It still adds quite a bit of information. All right, so I've only been talking for 40 minutes, so I don't really need to summarize what I've said. I hope you remember this is what I just said. So then this is, I'm now showing you how this differs by number of years, because what I've been doing is every year, no years, some years, and then this empirically shows us what it looks like by year. So what we've got here are the 8th grade score differences relative to the never poor, number of years spent in economic disadvantage. This is the raw difference. This is the demographic controls. This is the school fixed effects. This is a set of dummies. There is no structure put on this. I have not linearized this in any way. It looks pretty linear, right? It basically is, kind of marches up each year. Yep.
Have you looked at all at the timing of
Yes.
them? Okay.
And what you see, if you sort of parameterize it as lags, what you see is that the strongest relationship is between the past couple of years and scores, and then kindergarten or 1. Because, and mechanically, it's because, I kind of jumped over this at the start, the kids who enter in kindergarten are the ones that are least likely to exit. Right, so, in fact, I hate to close your eyes so you don't get dizzy here. If you're one of those people. There it is. Okay, so this one, I need to move this slide in the presentation. So this is a survival function. So how many years do you spend, are you still in the subsidized meal program based on what year you enter? Right. And so the kindergarten kids, you know, their line is above everybody else's, right? So, you know, 80% of them, 75% of them are still eligible and have been eligible in every year by 6th grade. The kids who enter in 6th grade, by contrast, tend to exit pretty quickly, right? So just knowing that somebody was eligible in kindergarten is probably going to tell you quite a bit. This is kind of nice for, you know, if you're trying to do, let's say, a VAM for 3rd graders when we don't have lag test scores in most states, because almost every state starts in 3rd grade. A control not just for are they currently disadvantaged, but were they disadvantaged as of 3rd grade would add a lot of information. So it gives you some traction on trying to say something about differences in outcomes for 3rd graders, even though you don't have any lag scores for them. All right, so this I thought was super interesting, and I was like, dosage. Each additional year spent in poverty has, you know, ticks you up another, you lose another 10th of a standard deviation relative to other kids. But this is now same kids, but they're 3rd grade test scores. And we're coding them as, you know, are you eventually going to be eligible for 9 years once you get to 8th grade? Right, so these kids have not yet spent 9 years in disadvantage, but they're going to. And this is their 3rd grade. This is not a dosage. This is not a year by year. It's that this is identifying kids who are whose families are getting $18,000. And basically each year, you're getting higher income. Right? So it's not that, you know, this is not 9 years of an equal dosage of income. It's that this is 9 years of very, very low income. And we basically, I think, traced out an income curve on these kids. So this is profoundly depressing. I mean, both of them are depressing, right? To think that this stuff is evolving year by year, but to think that it's already there, essentially, by 3rd grade is even more depressing. But I've come to be cheery. I come from the land of no sun and cold to bring these depressing results. Right?
So you said you also have 5th grade score?
Not in this presentation, but in the paper version. Yeah.
You know, maybe like, have you looked at, you know, what happens when the income sort of like bounces back? Like if you look between 3rd and 5th grade, you know, someone who like starts as cohort then bounces back to their scores bounce back
Haven't
to?
yet. I think we need to do, I think we, there's so many different things to do. We're gonna release one paper that's basically just kind of this stuff, like documenting this stuff. And then another might try to nail down the income dynamics. But we're gonna get this one out now, and then look at kids who move in and out. But as I said, I think the ones who move in and out, they're not traveling a huge distance. It's just that they were always kind of on the margin and they bounced above. It's not like kids who are down at $18,000 are bouncing for 1 year above 185% of poverty. So it's not, when they're, it's not like exiting welfare. It's like, you're moving around a fairly small area, I suspect. So if we can find a state where we actually have income and can match this on, that'd be great. But using the ECHLs, that's what it looks like is going on. This just makes, these are kind of indistinguishable in some places. The difference is about 0.2, but those are standard error bands. So, now this is a very pretty rainbow. What is it? Well, now we've got, this is the 8th grade plot that we've seen, and then this is the 3rd grade plot, and then this is every year in between. So this is the progress in the size of the gap that's going on from year to year. For a kid who's going to end up spending 9 years in disadvantage, this is how the gap evolves. For a kid who's going to spend 8 years, this is how the gap evolves. And it's basically, this is the change within a kid that we would expect to see in the test scores. Okay, so it's not this slope, which is sort of the time trend in individual kids' disadvantage, it's this. Okay? More sad faces in the audience. I'll come back with a true paper sometime soon. I've got a really nice paper on intervention to get kids like this into college, and showing really good results. So I'll come back with that to show that I can make happy faces. This gets at this question about income and how it tracks this eligibility. I gotta fix this. This would be better as a line graph. But so if you look at kindergarten income of kids who are never going to be eligible for subsidized lunch, right up to are going to spend 5 years when eligible, this is the income gradient. Right, so it's pretty clear that basically what we're picking up is an income gradient, and it's a percentage of poverty. Right, so the kids who are going to spend all 5 years, they're about 145% of poverty on average. The kids who are going to spend none at about 200% of poverty on average. And pretty much it just looks the same all the way across. So this is actually somewhat surprising to me because these families are aging, and typically, families' incomes go up. But then you think about what the income distribution is doing in the U.S., and almost none of the distribution is moving up. It's pretty stuck. So there's not much movement here. But this gives us a sense about how income is varying by that linear graph. Another summary. Implications. So I already flagged one. VAMs and school value added. Accountability, basically, where you're trying to control for differences between kids and between schools. This, not acknowledging this stuff, not controlling for it, is going to lead to biased estimates of teacher productivity, of school productivity. Also matters for policies that are trying to target resources on the neediest kids. Right? So when we've got this measure, which basically says 50% of kids are disadvantaged, it makes it pretty tough to target resources on the most disadvantaged kids. This would potentially give you a way to, say, weight federal spending for poor kids. The districts that have more of these persistently poor kids would get more money. Yep?
Is it pretty stable within a school, the proportion of kids who are persistently impoverished?
Haven't done that analysis yet.
That
would be an interesting one to do.
Because your implication of sort of saying like, oh, if we're targeting it, but we can't necessarily say a kid in kindergarten is going to be persistently impoverished.
Can't in kindergarten, but by 3rd grade, you can.
And we could target a school that had a history of having lots of kids.
Exactly. So a really revealing analysis, as I said, this could be a zillion different papers, and we're trying to focus it for one paper and get it out. Next is going to be looking at attainment. college going, high school dropout. But, doing basically some sort of ranking of school performance, school test scores, then controlling for demographics in kind of a standard BAM way, and then controlling for this. How do schools move around in their ranking when you do this? This matters a lot for the new federal elementary and secondary law. It explicitly says states have to somehow identify the 5% poorest performing schools. And whether you pay attention to this or not is going to affect who gets defined as poorest performing. Yep.
Just curious, if you clumped it a little bit different, where, let's say you looked at third grade test scores, and you clumped students by their test score, and then compared how their test scores would look in 5th grade and 8th grade. So you're looking at students of similar
It's like controlling for lag test scores.
Yeah, so you're looking at students of similar test scores, and then looking at how the students with similar test scores changed based on differences in income.
Isn't that what the lags test score specification gets us?
Yeah. But I'm just saying, I guess,
It's a parametric way to get at it. You're sort of saying within, test score bins, but the spirit of it is achieved
so
by
I'm just
controlling for
wondering
lag
where,
test
if
scores.
say the high test score, low income people, if they continued to stay at high test score even though they're low income, or did their gap become?
Sounds like another paper. So, yep.
Is that
We
way you're
haven't-
not talking about quantity, you're talking about the different, where you'd think based on your data that there would be very few, if any, high achieving, low income
That's
students.
right. You
But-
know that without even looking at my particular data.
But
yeah.
then the need for those students, you could then emphasize how are those students doing compared with the other high achieving, high income students. Because if that number starts out decent at 3rd grade and is gone by 8th grade, that's something
Well,
in
we know
pure
the gap,
numbers
so
that might
that,
not show
we
up.
know
in
the
here.
gap is going up, and I think what you're asking is the gap going up because, across the distribution, all of these kids are sort of marching backwards relative to the other kids, or is it that some are falling further and further behind? So it's like a compositional question. Where does this, we see this average, but what do the quantiles look like?
Yeah.
Might be another way to put what you're saying in a very sterile way, right? But what do the quantiles look like over time, right? With each additional year. So like I said, another paper. Yep.
I think another implication has to do with charter schools. So, all the reports in California and nationally are showing that, or at least in California and LA Unified, that the charter schools are serving equal proportion of the low income kids. But then there are people who are saying that's actually not true. They're sort of cherry-picking the top of the low income. Like you could actually look at that here.
Yep. Did I already say that I know I told you about this, but I presented this in Chicago, and folks, stop me if I said this already. This is my second day presenting the same paper,
No.
talking to lots of people. Okay, so the people from the Chicago Consortium for School Research came, and they were really excited about this because they've got a ton of schools that are all like 95%, subsidized lunch eligible, but they have a sense looking in the schools that there are some impoverished schools and there are other impoverished schools. And they're interested in using this as a way to get at some of these schools are just different from the other schools.
So in California with the HPI, we've had a track record of looking at parents' level of education, and this goes to Catherine's point. But when you look at parents' level of education against the poverty rate, you actually see differences in the parents' level of education. The distribution of parents' level of education, they get slightly more educated even though they stay poor. When you start to look at their very discrete data at the state.
So education, as you saw from those
Right,
summary
which
statistics, is sort of a
maybe
good
match
measure
with
of
the
permanent
distribution,
income.
the changes in
Yeah.
income.
Yeah.
So we're doing, we're going to replicate this, as I said, using Florida data. Florida has matched its school data to birth certificates, which include mom's education and mom's age of birth of the kid. So that's going to give us 2 more pieces of information about socioeconomic status, and again, we can sort of look at to what extent those variables win or lose in a horse race against this measure, right? And give us some more flesh on what this measure means, how these people differ from each other. So matters for targeting money in some way. Looking at so there's bunch of the Title I funding is targeted based on neighborhood income and neighborhood poverty, as opposed to what's actually going on in the school. So they use the neighborhood information, which might not be the same. I don't know how they do this with charter schools though, right? Because charter school, do you know the Title I funding, how it flows? So, they're catching kids from all sorts of neighborhoods, so I don't know
They
how.
have to report after their first year, they begin to report that data to the state.
So they report their share, and that's how it gets
That's how
targeted?
it gets targeted.
Okay. In other places, the other schools, it's often based just on what's the neighborhood. So another interesting paper would be comparing what do you get when you compare neighborhood measures of disadvantage to these measures? Does this get you a more accurate measure of the disadvantage in the neighborhood? Because it's been treated as, well, this neighborhood data is finer because it's income from like the American Community Survey, for example. But if it's not the kids who are actually at the school, it may not actually win the horse race with these data. But because income's not gathered in the schools, they've been relying on the neighborhood measures. So this would be, a way to potentially at the school level get more accurate information.
Also, there's all this talk, here LCSF is the lead in student funding framework, and we do it on FRPL, you would think
Yep.
about how does
Exactly.
that change how a school would get money.
Exactly. So targeting in terms of money, targeting in terms of supports in the classroom.
Yeah.
This kid we expect on observables is going to be having a harder time than this kid. In analyses, so if you're doing some sort of observational analysis of a program, you don't have a randomized trial and you're trying to use controls to get at differences between those who are being treated and those who are not, this could pick up some heterogeneity that otherwise would not be picked up and be biasing your analyses. Stratification of analyses of program effects. So if you want to know whether a given program helps the worse off kids the most, right now, pretty much you get this 50% measure. And it may well be that when we see a program works well for what we're calling poor kids, it's skimming off the top. Like maybe it's doing well for those kids who are moving in and out, but maybe not doing as well for the 14% who are always poor, right? So a bunch of ways in which I think this measure could be useful for policy as well as for practice. And that is it. This is our acknowledgement that all of our partners say that we must put on here, right? So these are our state partners who give us the data. These are our federal partners that give us our salaries. And they're not responsible for anything that we do unless they like it.
So we have maybe time for one last question and then we'll call it.
Yep.
Is there anything in the data set, say for instance, at 8th grade, if any of the students were asked whether they thought intelligence was fixed?
There's no survey data in here whatsoever. It's all administrative
Because
data.
that could be very
That could
telling.
be the nice thing about the administrative data is you have a sampling frame. And, if you want to do some qualitative research that goes with these data sets, you can use the administrative data to create a sampling frame and use it to go after some qualitative questions of parents, of students, whoever you want to.
All right, thank you. That was great.